So, a secret portfolio of Princess Diana's most precious missing jewelry just turned up at a commercial auction house under the private ownership of Queen Camilla's daughter. It happened on a quiet, unremarkable morning in London, with Laura Lopes casually sliding a breathtaking black diamond pendant and a complex sapphire bracelet across the velvet appraisal desk at Sotheby's, as if they were nothing more than simple civilian hand-me-downs. And this is where the timeline gets strange. For over 2 decades, these specific artifacts had simply ceased to exist within the royal inventory. They were not misplaced during a busy transition of power, nor were they accidentally boxed away in the sprawling, cavernous archives of the royal collection. They were deliberately left off the official Crown Estate registers, existing in a silent, suffocating legal vacuum where no palace archivist could log them and no financial auditor could ever demand their return. When a royal asset of this unimaginable historical magnitude moves from one location to another, there is supposed to be an endless trail of heavily redacted paperwork, a flurry of discreet courier movements, and mandatory signatures from the highest-ranking chancellors in the realm. Here, there was absolutely nothing. The normal procedures that govern the lives and properties of the monarchy were completely and ruthlessly suspended. That is not an oversight born of grief or administrative confusion. That is a targeted extraction. The pieces were silently ushered out of the protected sphere of the crown and submerged into the private shadow economy of the queen consort's extended family. The single physical detail that proves the breathtaking audacity of this wrongness is the complete absence of the royal crest on the intake documents at the auction house. They were logged under a private citizen's name, quietly filed into a commercial cataloging system explicitly designed to wash their provenance clean and establish a brand new, legally unassailable chain of ownership. But here is where it gets genuinely dark. The people orchestrating this transition knew exactly what they were holding. They knew that if these gems remained hidden for just a little longer, the original memory of their rightful owner would fade enough for them to be safely liquidated into pure, untraceable capital. They banked on the assumption that the institution would be too polite, too terrified of public scandal, to launch a formal investigation into the queen consort's own bloodline. They expected the current monarch to look the other way, his silence telling everyone that he preferred the quiet comfort of his marriage over the cold, hard administration of justice. According to people present within the deepest circles of the royal household, her camp allegedly believed they had successfully navigated the gap between what they wanted and what they were actually allowed to take. Ask yourself something uncomfortable. How does a civilian walk into one of the most prestigious auction houses on the planet with the most recognizable sapphire bracelet in modern British history and expect no one to sound the alarm? They do it because they believe they have absolute, untouchable protection from the highest office in the land. They do it because the silence surrounding these jewels had been strictly enforced by an invisible network of loyalists for a very long time. But they severely miscalculated the patience and the absolute ruthlessness of the man who is next in line to inherit the throne. When the internal reference photograph accidentally flashed across a security review desk at Kensington Palace, the reaction was not explosive rage. It was a cold, institutional pivot. The Prince of Wales did not reach for the telephone to scream at his stepmother. He did not draft a furious public statement. He signed the retaliatory legal orders without a word, without a press conference, and without a single shred of visible anger. The silence that followed was louder than anything said. This was not a clumsy family misunderstanding over inherited trinkets. This was a calculated, multi-generational heist, engineered to strip the direct line of succession of its most potent historical artifacts, and Prince William just decided to burn their entire operation to the ground. Before we go any further, make sure you subscribe to Royal Signal so you do not miss what comes next. There is a lot more to this story, and it is still unfolding. The whole thing actually starts with a seemingly mundane portfolio adjustment, and almost nobody paid attention at the time. In early May, a massive liquidation of commercial real estate from the Duchy of Cornwall was quietly executed. We are talking about the sudden offloading of £500 million worth of historic, prime assets. To the untrained eye, or a bored financial analyst reading the bottom ticker of a news broadcast, it looked like standard administrative housekeeping, a boring restructuring of a massive 700-year-old estate that traditionally funds the heir to the throne. It felt trivially small compared to the absolute devastation that was about to follow. But this was the quiet loading of a weapon. The Prince of Wales was moving his chess pieces into a formation of pure offense, laying the groundwork for a strike so severe that it would sever the financial arteries of the king's own household. The public announcement said the money was being freed up to be put back into local housing schemes and community programs across the country, which made everyone assume Prince William was simply modernizing his charitable footprint and playing the role of the benevolent future king. It played perfectly into the carefully constructed image of public service that Kensington Palace relies on. But according to what is now coming out, that exact same week, a brutal financial severing was already in motion behind the heavy oak doors of the royal estate. While the press praised the modern philanthropic air, the private reality was something entirely different. A labyrinth of private trusts and civilian funds operating in the murky areas of the royal ecosystem were being systematically hunted down and dismantled. For more than 2 decades, income from the periphery of the duchy had been quietly channeled toward Queen Camilla's personal and familial circle. These were the kind of cozy, insider trading agreements that flourish in historic institutions where tradition and personal relationships obscure the boundaries of formal accounting. That is not innocent financial planning. That is a structural parasite. The gap between the public charity narrative and this private financial slaughter was massive. And the people who benefited from that gap existing were the exact same people attempting to whitewash Diana's legacy at a commercial auction house. The Queen Consort's loyalists had grown incredibly comfortable living off this diverted shadow income, relying on the quiet, polite complacency of the institution to keep their pockets lined. Someone inside the highest levels of the king's financial advisory team made the decision to suppress this parasitic arrangement and let the public believe the false version of a perfectly unified, financially independent family. They chose to hide the fact that the Queen Consort's civilian relatives were being subsidized by the very estate meant to fund the direct line of succession. This was not a passive omission. It was an active, daily decision to look the other way. The king himself refused to confirm or deny these arrangements, his silence telling everyone exactly where his loyalties lay. He chose to bury the truth, to preserve the peace in his marriage, prioritizing the comfort of his wife's extended circle over the fiduciary duty of the crown. Clarence House thrived in this deliberately engineered darkness, assuming their financial safety net was untouchable as long as the king reigned. But they fundamentally misunderstood the man who had just inherited the keys to that estate. This buried financial truth is the actual fire underneath everything that followed at the auction house. Because if you are Prince William and you have just discovered your mother's sapphire bracelet being fenced through civilian channels by the exact same people who have been quietly draining your estate for 20 years, you are not thinking about diplomatic family relations or saving face in the Sunday papers. You are thinking about total financial decapitation. You are thinking about permanent, institutional eradication. The confrontation that effectively shattered the royal family was never meant to be witnessed. But in the frantic, highly charged administrative chaos of a late Friday afternoon, a junior equerry carrying dispatch boxes failed to fully latch the heavy oak door leading into the king's private study at Clarence House. It left a narrow, fatal gap of visible space, transforming a private execution into an overheard historical rupture. Queen Camilla did not discover the sudden collapse of her family's financial security from her husband, as one might expect. Instead, she found out through a frantic, legally sterile phone call from her personal wealth manager, delivered in that careful, cold tone people use when they know their words are about to detonate. The advisor informed her that every single account linked to her daughter had just been frozen by a High Court Mareva injunction. The Queen Consort physically recoiled. She froze, her hand gripping the mahogany stair railing so tightly her knuckles instantly turned white, before she ended the call, turned on her heel, and marched directly toward the king's study. She pushed aggressively through the unlatched door, abandoning all protocol. Inside, the king sat heavily behind his desk, while the Prince of Wales stood perfectly still by the fireplace, calmly reviewing a leather-bound legal folder. Camilla's accusation was intensely personal, bleeding with a wounded, desperate disbelief. Her camp had allegedly spent decades maneuvering her into a position of unassailable security, and now it was crumbling in real time. She aimed her fury not at the prince, but directly at her husband, the tragic king. She reminded him loudly of the decades she had endured in the shadows, the relentless public abuse she had absorbed to faithfully stand by his side, and the absolute loyalty she had delivered. She demanded to know how he could allow his heir to unleash an elite legal strike force against her own daughter over a handful of inherited trinkets. She spoke of what she believed she had rightfully earned after all this time, a permanent, protected sanctuary for her entire bloodline within the royal fold. The Prince of Wales did not shout. He did not engage with her emotional outburst. His power was pure restraint and institutional action. He closed the folder with a sharp, decisive snap that echoed like a gunshot in the silent room. His response was entirely institutional, cold, and stripped away the personal elements completely. He looked directly at his stepmother, dismantling 20 years of her carefully constructed illusions in a single breath. The crown was never yours to strip. You were merely permitted to stand beside it. The queen consort immediately turned her desperate gaze to the king, waiting for him to defend her, waiting for him to overrule his son and protect the woman he had sacrificed his public reputation to marry. But he said nothing. His silence told everyone in that building exactly how the balance of power had permanently shifted. He refused to confirm or deny her accusations. He did not reprimand the heir. He did not reach out to comfort his wife. He stayed exactly where he was, slowly removing his reading glasses, staring down at the finalized royal decree bearing his own signature, the very document that had authorized the police raid in Wiltshire. The king was no longer acting as a husband. He was the institution choosing itself over the people inside it. That unbearable silence was his final, devastating answer. What each person carried out of that room fundamentally altered the trajectory of the monarchy. Queen Camilla turned and walked out with a wound that cut far deeper than frozen bank accounts and seized assets. This brutal confrontation did not create her insecurity. It violently reopened a wound from her distant past. For decades, she had fought tirelessly to erase her status as the hated outsider, clawing her way into the inner sanctum to prove she belonged. Now, she was brutally reminded that to the true bloodline, she would always be a temporary resident. She had been quietly angling for permanence, yet she left the room realizing her family's safety was entirely dependent on a king who could no longer defend her against the absolute authority of the future monarch. The Prince of Wales, however, bore the immense, isolating burden of what it cost him to make this choice. He walked out knowing he had forever destroyed whatever fragile peace existed within his father's twilight years. He had weaponized the cold machinery of the state against his own household, proving he would mercilessly guard his mother's physical legacy, but at the cost of total, irreversible family fracture. And that is where the danger truly lies. Because a cornered queen consort, stripped of her financial leverage and publicly humiliated, has nothing left to lose. What she might do with this profound, reopened wound, and the shadow networks she might still call upon in retaliation, makes this uneasy silence far more terrifying than the initial explosion. To understand what Queen Camilla is actually losing, and the terrifying historical weight the Prince of Wales is now so ruthlessly defending, you need to understand what this specific collection of artifacts has already survived. This is not just background context to a modern family feud. This is rapid escalation. These are not merely shiny rocks sitting passively in velvet boxes, waiting to be worn at a state banquet. These gems are entities with their own violent, uncompromising histories. They carry the immense, crushing weight of centuries, and their sudden appearance at a civilian auction house in London is just the latest, most foolish chapter in a long, dark saga of royal betrayal. The sapphire bracelet alone carries a terrifying, documented blood cost. Its central stones were not peacefully mined or politely gifted. They were violently extracted during a period of brutal colonial expansion, cut from the earth by men who never lived to see the final polished facets. In the 17th century, a remarkably similar set of royal sapphires caused the absolute ruin of an entire aristocratic faction. People were exiled, stripped of their hereditary titles, blinded, and locked away in the freezing damp of the Tower of London over the mere unproven rumor that they had attempted to divert crown jewels into a private family holding. Sir Thomas Overbury was poisoned, and the powerful Earl of Somerset was utterly destroyed, his reputation publicly shattered, and his vast wealth seized entirely by the crown, simply for attempting to hide a fraction of the king's precious gems for his own bloodline. The physical objects possess a literal body count. They are deeply soaked in the blind ambition and the ultimate ruin of those who arrogantly believed they could outsmart the institution, proving that these items demand a brutal toll from anyone who touches them without absolute permission. And the pattern of betrayal surrounding these specific pieces is not new. Decades before Princess Diana ever wore them, there was the theft that almost worked. During the chaotic, disorganized reorganization of the royal vaults following the Second World War, A highly trusted minor courtier quietly slipped a cache of uninventoried diamonds out of the heavily guarded basements of Buckingham Palace. The method they used perfectly mirrors the current threat posed by the Queen Consort's camp. They deliberately disguised the royal provenance, attempting to quietly appraise the stones through civilian channels in Switzerland to secretly fund a lavish, unauthorized retirement. They came terrifyingly close to successfully liquidating untouchable history. The plot was only stopped by a ruthless, unannounced audit by the Lord Chamberlain, who dispatched Scotland Yard detectives to seize the assets before the ink on the private sale documents could dry. That courtier was quietly and permanently erased from royal history. Their pension was severed immediately, their name was never spoken again, and they died in total disgrace. The institutional memory of the crown is absolute, and it never forgives a theft, no matter how politely or quietly it is executed. It shows that the pattern of betrayal is not new, and the punishment is always total erasure. But the black diamond pendant carries a completely different, far more volatile frequency. It represents a massive, active international wound. The central black stone was allegedly acquired during a highly controversial diplomatic exchange in the late 19th century, and another sovereign nation still quietly believes it was stolen from their own ancestral treasury during a military campaign. To this day, foreign diplomats raise the issue quietly during tense, closed-door state banquets, effectively turning the stone into a silent geopolitical hostage. This is the staggering international weight that now sits entirely on the shoulders of the future king. By attempting to legitimize this specific pendant through a commercial auction, Laura Lopes was not just fencing a necklace, she was blindly stumbling into a decades-old international dispute. Her camp allegedly threatened to trigger a massive diplomatic incident just to secure a quick financial payout for her own private estate. The sheer arrogance of treating a geopolitical landmine as a personal financial asset proves how dangerously disconnected the Queen Consort's inner circle had become from the reality of the crown. They were playing with fire that could burn the entire diplomatic standing of the nation. And after all of that, after surviving brutal colonial extraction, aristocratic betrayals, near-successful international smuggling rings, and centuries of bitter dynastic warfare, this sacred legacy was almost decided by a civilian auction gavel in London. It was nearly wiped out by the Queen's daughter in a clumsy, desperate grab for independent wealth. Ask yourself if Queen Camilla and her inner circle fully understand what they are holding. Ask yourself if they comprehend the constitutional inferno they ignited the moment they tried to treat the crown's violent, untouchable history as their own personal inheritance. And this brutal legal confrontation did not come from nowhere. It had been building quietly for decades, simmering beneath the polite smiles and carefully choreographed balcony appearances. The auction house discovery was merely the breaking point of a pattern of erasure that began long before the Prince of Wales ever inherited his vast estate. The warning signs began years ago, disguised as a minor administrative slight that seemed almost trivial at the time. Shortly after his wedding, the prince formally asked his father's office for a specific, seemingly insignificant collection of his late mother's private letters and a minor set of pearl earrings to be transferred to Kensington Palace. The request was entirely reasonable and historically standard, yet it was firmly denied. The denial did not come in the form of a personal conversation or an emotional family dispute. Instead, it arrived through cold institutional channels, a sterile memorandum signed by a mid-level clerk inside Clarence House, stating that the items were, quote, unavailable for release due to ongoing archival preservation. Nobody apologized. Nobody explained who had authorized the sudden preservation hold on his own mother's private possessions. The prince, understanding the fragile public relations ecosystem surrounding his newly married stepmother, accepted the memorandum without a word. He did not leak his frustration to the press. He said absolutely nothing publicly, absorbing the institutional block as an unfortunate administrative error, rather than a deliberate personal attack. But the true nature of that block revealed itself a few years later, elevating the pattern from a mere bureaucratic hurdle to a visible, calculated insult. The exact same set of pearl earrings that had been deemed too delicate to leave the royal vaults suddenly appeared in public. They were not worn by the Princess of Wales. They were photographed adorning the neck of a close, personal friend of Queen Camilla at an exclusive private gala in London. The Prince of Wales did not find out through an apologetic phone call or a private family briefing. He discovered the betrayal the exact same way the general public did, through flashing cameras and glossy society pages. It was a staggering realization that his mother's legacy was being treated as a private costume box for his stepmother's extended social circle. Still, adhering strictly to the unwritten rules of royal survival, he said absolutely nothing publicly. He did not demand the earrings back. But that was the exact moment he stopped giving Clarence House the benefit of the doubt, and he started quietly keeping records. Which brings us directly to the current constitutional inferno. This was the third time, except this time, the scale, the financial stakes, and the sheer visibility of the betrayal were completely different. This was not a misplaced letter or a loaned pair of earrings. This was a highly coordinated, incredibly lucrative operation to permanently launder some of the most valuable historical assets of the crown through a commercial auction house. It was the absolute climax of a decades-long strategy to systematically strip the direct line of succession of its inheritance, forcing the future king to either surrender his mother's memory entirely or launch an unprecedented legal strike against his own family. The Queen Consort's camp allegedly believed their earlier, smaller victories meant they could operate with total impunity, but according to people who have worked closely with him for years, he kept a private, careful record of every single occasion where his mother's legacy was suppressed, diverted, or exploited. This was a silent archive of grievances, a meticulously documented timeline of every slight, every missing item, and every blocked request, all filed away quietly in the secure vaults of Kensington Palace. The sheer vagueness of what else is contained within those private ledgers is what makes his sudden retaliation so utterly terrifying for anyone who has ever crossed him. That kind of patient, buried anger tends to be far more dangerous than anything loud, because it never fades. It only builds, and the person who finally acts on it has been thinking about exactly what to do, and exactly how to dismantle their enemy, for a very long time. Some of you are probably wondering whether the Prince of Wales can even do this without permission. You are asking whether he can legally freeze the assets of the Queen Consort's daughter this fast, whether an heir to the throne can simply bypass the reigning monarch and weaponize the elite levels of the British legal system against a member of his own extended family. Can he unilaterally unleash the police on a civilian estate without Parliament intervening? The short answer is yes, absolutely. And understanding the architecture of how he did it is crucial, because this is exactly why the trap snapped shut so perfectly around Clarence House. The entire operation hinges on a very specific, deeply buried constitutional power known as the letters patent for asset reclassification, combined with the extreme civil authority of a Mareva injunction. When Prince William assumed control of the Duchy of Cornwall, he did not just inherit a massive portfolio of organic farms and coastal properties. He inherited an independent legal fortress. Under ancient succession law, the Prince of Wales holds the autonomous right to protect the Crown's inherited assets if he believes the sovereign is either compromised, incapacitated, or unwilling to act fiduciarily. He used this exact framework to bypass his father entirely. Legally, the Prince of Wales is allowed to do exactly what he did. No permission slip required. No vote taken. Nothing. He did not need the king's active blessing to petition the High Court. He only needed the king's signature on a single decree, recognizing the historical status of the artifacts, a signature obtained under the heavy threat of triggering a constitutional regency crisis. Once that specific legal classification was secured, he held the supreme authority to hunt down the stolen property as a direct agent of the Crown. What made this so unusual was not whether he had the right to pursue Crown property. It was the terrifying speed, the timing, and the lethal combination of moves. When institutional changes of this magnitude occur inside the monarchy, they normally take years of careful diplomatic unwinding. Bureaucrats hold endless committee meetings, transition teams negotiate quiet financial settlements, and everyone involved is given enough time to save face and adjust their portfolios. This happened in mere days. A massive financial liquidation, a constitutional ultimatum delivered in a private study, and an elite police raid executed at dawn, all cascading with the unstoppable, merciless velocity of a military strike. And it was all done entirely in the dark, which is the ultimate display of absolute power. When previous royal estate restructuring happened, the palace celebrated, issued glowing statements about modernizing the monarchy, and held press conferences detailing their transparency. This time, there was absolutely nothing. There were no palace spokespeople briefing friendly journalists, no off-the-record whispers to royal correspondents. Just a quiet legal filing buried deep in the High Court registry, where nobody would think to look, activating a freezing order typically used to paralyze international crime syndicates and hostile oligarchs. They completely erased Laura Lopes from her own financial existence without a single word spoken to the press. And that silence screams louder than any press release ever could. It signals a complete institutional blackout that left the Queen Consort utterly defenseless. Look closely at the rapidly accelerating timeline. He liquidated £500 million of duchy assets, severed the shadow trusts feeding Clarence House, secured a ministerial-level search warrant, and executed a dawn raid in Wiltshire, all within a matter of hours. Individually, each of these steps could be disguised as routine estate management or a localized legal dispute. Stacked together, they reveal a pattern of extreme, breathless urgency. Royal historians who have studied past reigns say they cannot find another example of this many major powers shifting this fast without an official announcement ever confirming why. The shockwaves from the brutal Wiltshire Dawn raid have already begun reshaping the physical reality inside the palace walls this very week. The changes are concrete, highly visible, and utterly chilling if you know exactly where to look. The heavy mahogany door to the Queen Consort's private administrative suite, a room usually propped open with a constant, confident flurry of aides moving in and out, has remained firmly shut for 5 consecutive days. Her most senior financial liaison, the man allegedly responsible for managing those severed shadow trusts, cleared his desk completely by late Tuesday evening and has not returned to the royal grounds. Furthermore, the Queen Consort herself skipped several minor engagements she would normally never miss, including a highly publicized charity reception in London, where she was slated to be the central guest of honor. Her aides hastily cited scheduling conflicts, but her inner circle is currently described as unusually withdrawn, their usual confident, off-the-record leaks to the press entirely absent. Silence inside a family built entirely on carefully managed public appearances is rarely ever just silence. It is almost always a decision being made behind closed doors, a frantic recalibration of survival tactics when the ground has unexpectedly given way beneath them. But what is happening in plain sight is nothing compared to the institutional fortress being built in the shadows. According to people familiar with private discussions happening inside the palace, Kensington Palace is not simply resting on the laurels of a successful asset freeze. They are quietly preparing a permanent, ironclad trust structure known legally as a sovereign covenant. This is not idle speculation. This is highly classified, leaked intelligence, originating from the very legal chambers that executed the freezing order in the first place. This specific mechanism is being designed to legally excommunicate the king's household from ever touching the Wales family inherited assets again. It operates as a binding legal firewall, preemptively blocking any future attempts to blur the lines between the Crown estate and civilian holdings. By invoking a sovereign covenant, the Prince of Wales is fundamentally rewriting the internal financial architecture of the monarchy. He is ensuring that the moment the crown eventually passes, the Queen Consort's remaining loyalists will have absolutely zero institutional leverage. The paperwork is allegedly being finalized right now, quietly gathering the necessary signatures from top chancellors. Yet, beneath these calculated legal maneuvers lies a far more terrifying reality. At least one senior legal advisor has reportedly raised a possibility dark enough to shake anyone who thinks this story is finished. The nuclear option that nobody wants to say out loud is that the jewelry recovered from Laura Lopes was merely a decoy, a clumsy distraction, while the true vault of 12 missing historical artifacts was successfully smuggled out of the country and securely absorbed into American corporate entities. Entities safely shielded by Delaware privacy laws and allegedly linked directly to the Montecito connection. If this is true, the heir to the throne is no longer fighting a localized family dispute. He is facing an international, highly funded extraction of his mother's legacy, orchestrated by exiled members of his own bloodline. Nothing this binding, this total, and this unprecedented has ever been attempted this far in advance, which means everything the Prince of Wales has just survived might not be the end of this war at all. It might only be the opening shot, and this shadow war will not stay hidden for much longer. We are rapidly approaching the annual publication of the Sovereign Grant Financial Audit, an unavoidable legal deadline and public event that will force this entire crisis out into the open. palace staff have quietly started using language normally reserved for occasions of historic finality when discussing this year's financial disclosures. There are whispers of extra auditing preparations, external forensic accountants being brought in, and legal reviews of the duchy boundaries that nobody has explained and nobody has denied. The king will be legally required to present a transparent accounting of his household's finances, fully exposing the newly restricted boundaries imposed by his heir. Ask yourself why extreme forensic accounting preparations would be necessary for a routine, ordinary financial event, and you already know why so many people close to this family believe they know exactly what is coming. The queen consort did not speak. She did not approach the microphones, nor did she issue a frantic clarification through her usual allies in the British press. She merely stood by the high arched window of Clarence House late into the evening, staring out across the darkened courtyard as the final courier cars from Kensington Palace departed into the London mist. The absolute stillness of her posture was the ultimate signal of an unspoken, devastating comprehension. She was a woman who had spent more than 30 years expertly navigating the dangerous, shifting currents of public opinion and palace intrigue, yet her gaze remained fixed on an empty courtyard that now mirrored the sudden chilling vacuum of her own institutional influence. Her silence was not a pause in the drama. It was the heavy, suffocating weight of realizing that the intricate network of patronage she had spent decades constructing had been permanently locked from the outside by a stepson who refused to negotiate. The real question was never whether Laura Lopes would face a public, ruinous trial for possessing plundered crown property. It was always whether the tragic king would choose to protect his wife's private family or completely surrender to the absolute, ruthless authority of his own heir. The superficial drama of the auction house has vanished, revealing a far deeper, more structural rupture that splits the House of Windsor directly down the center. By forcing his father to choose between marital peace and constitutional duty, the Prince of Wales did not just recover two missing artifacts. He successfully executed a silent coup over the administration of the royal estate, leaving the world to wonder what happens to a reigning monarch when his own successor controls the keys to the castle, and whether the remaining 12 missing treasures hidden away behind the corporate veil of American law will even still exist within the reach of the British institution by the time the public finally demands an answer. Nothing this profoundly destabilizing has torn through the very fabric of this family since the abdication crisis of the 20th century. A historic decision that shook the monarchy to its absolute foundations, overthrew a king, and forever altered the geopolitical trajectory of the realm. What is unfolding right now behind closed palace doors feels just as seismic, just as permanent, and just as utterly irreversible. History does not usually announce itself with a public press release. It happens in the cold, unyielding silence of a Wiltshire dawn raid, in the frantic, closed-door negotiations of a Norfolk estate, and in the quiet, decisive scratching of an heir's pen, rewriting the future of the monarchy on a single sheet of parchment. The war for Princess Diana's jewels has been won. The boundaries of power have been permanently redrawn, and the future king has shown the world exactly how far he will go to protect his line, leaving everyone to watch the rapidly approaching financial audit with absolute dread, wondering exactly which hidden vault the Prince of Wales will target next.